Good afternoon and welcome to the first edition of Friday Nights of Yore, where we talk about high school football games past and past. The presentation, this video is just going to be about the process of how I rank teams from the past, and we'll go through that. More of a reference than anything else. So Friday Nights of Yore, and I have a link down below as far as current ratings. I will be updating those throughout the year as I get more data and from my last year's accumulation. Future videos, today is just the algorithm, and we'll talk about rating types, the year-to-year comparison and how that's done, home field advantage, forfeits, disputed scores, overtime games, and ties, how those are handled through the computer ratings. And then talk about an iterative power rating system that I use, an example schedule, and flaws in the system. And I won't talk about this week as far as the top 25, but we'll do that once the season begins, hopefully in 2020. Week from now, games in Alaska will be starting to come in, and we'll have ratings after the first week of those games. And as far as the weekly schedule, August 13th is today. We'll talk about the algorithm, and next week we'll talk about the top 25 of all time as far as in detail. I will update my link to the top 1,000 on the website, and you can scroll through that after the update, or you can do it right now as far as just what my current rankings are. August 27th, the top programs of all times will be the schools that for whatever reason, year after year, even after 100 years, they are top of the line teams, whether they're national champions or state champions. They always seem to be there. You have to go through them. Cincinnati, Moeller to if you're going to do anything in Ohio, Moeller seems to be always there. Yearly national champions as far as the media, and my own results. And so there will be only one team per year. We'll talk about those teams and how they compare to each other, and how they compare. You didn't have computers doing these calculations back in 1910, and see how what was rated back then is number one versus going through more of a systematic system. And the top teams by decade, I do the first 3 decades, 2010s, 2000s, and 90s, and I'll go to the top 3 states as far as having teams in the top 1,000 of all time. Types of ratings, and I've included all of these into my combined strength, which would be the margin of victory, which is weighted the most. Win-loss is second as far as how it's weighted in my system. But both of those take the margin of victory of each team or each game for each team, and puts that to a weighted amount based on previous iterations, and we'll talk about that iterative process. The log margin of victory, that's for like runaway games. It's not heavily weighted because it's not very predictive as far as how a team will do in a future game. So it's weighted less as the same criteria as how margin of victory and win-loss is used. It's how well it predicts future games. Offense and defense. Defense is very hard to characterize, and it's the same for offense for the same reason, is because defense is, as far as you can't get below 0, so a real strong defense, best they can do is have a shutout. They can't have a negative score, and so that comes out not as straightforward as the other types of ratings. And then a combine, again, that's done by the weights based on predictive results. So the end of the season for a lot of states is week 40, 41, 42. And what I do is take that week's final results and see how they predict the playoff games and the championships, and then use those predictive strengths, there's margin of victory or win-loss, as the final combination of the ratings. Year-to-year comparisons, very difficult to do, but I'm doing it here. So I think it can be done to some degree, but the point is it's beginning of the discussion in a methodical way, a consistent way for every team and every year. I know it's got flaws to it, and look at the weights and heights of teams back in the 20s that are comparable ratings to what I'm saying is now, and yeah, that's probably not a fair comparison, as well as just the style of game that's played back then versus now. But it is what it is, and I don't know any other way to do it. The assumption is the combined average of all the teams and all their strength is that pool is going to be the same every year, or from one year to the next. And so you look at all the teams that played in 2019, and you predict where, like a preseason poll of what the 2020 teams' strengths are, and that's the starting point of that. And so that feeds into the algorithm as far as the week 0 iteration, the preseason ranking, which is the last 2 seasons of their ratings, their final ratings. So example would be in Team A 2018, a final rating of 50, 2019 final rating of 40, so preseason iteration 0 would be a 45. Same thing for Team B 2018, final rating of 30, 2019 40, 2020 their preseason rating would be 35 if those 2 seasons played. I'll say in week 1, then Team A wins over B by 4 points. So you combined the average iteration of 0, which is 40, and then you take the winning margin and divided it by 2, because that margin of victory is going to be split between the 2 teams. So Team A would be 42, and if in Team B, same thing, only we're going to subtract the 2 from its initial rating, which would be a 38. I handle these pretty straightforward. Home field advantage, typically it's about 3.25 per game. If the location is unknown, I treat it as a neutral site, in which case the margin is the margin and it's not adjusted. Otherwise, the winning team margin is decreased by a half of 3.25, which is, I'm not going to guess here, 1 7/8. And same thing for the away team, then that same amount is going to be added to their share of the margin. Forfeits are not included if the score is not known, so it's going to be treated as 1-0, and it's going to be thrown out as far as the ratings. And if it is known, as far as the score is 35 to 24 on the field, that margin of victory will be used in the rating system. There's reasons for why I do that. kind of unfair to have them included, but it's also unfair to when a team beats them or is very strong against a team that has an extra player that shouldn't be there, then that at least counts for them. Yeah, I particularly want to use that for games a long time ago where there's hardly any scores available. Overtime game margins are treated the same as any other margin. Would like to change them, but it gets complicated as far as probably overtime games should be treated as zero margin plus a 0.1 or something like that for the winning team, just to make it more predictive. Ties equals 0, but the home field advantage team or the home team would lose that 3.25 divided by 2, and the away team would be added to their scores. So the iterative power rating system, similar to the year-to-year calculation, but it's only within once you start with the average of the last 2 years, then the 2,448 steps that are used as far as the iterative process are only within year scores, so we'll have an example shown here as far as how that works, but basically the preseason feeds into loop 1. The loop 1 results feed into loop 2, and so on and so on. It takes about 6 hours to calculate that as far as 2019 scores, and it used to take 20 hours before I upgraded my computer last year. So here's an example. Here's Mount Pleasant, my hometown, my home high school, my home team played last year, and the games that they won, including the playoff games and the out of conference games. So you get into the conference games to kind of cement how well that conference is, because they all play each other. But the out of state or the non-conference games also helped as far as comparing one conference to another. So Midland might play, or Mount Pleasant might play Petoskey, Kiwanah Hills, and Cedar Springs. Midland might play Grand Rapids, the Detroit school, and an Upper Peninsula school. So all that pools in and kind of cements the strength of the conference schedule as far as just how they rate compared to other conferences. And even though it's not set as far as a matter, it's in principle, it gives the strength to the conference because they all play each other so many times. So as you can see through the process, take Mount Pleasant, 2017, I got a 15 rating. 2028, I have a 28. Average those two to 22, and then that feeds into rating 1. And then after that, it's not brought back into the system, it's just a starting point. And so after iteration 1, they had a rating of 30. And just for background, this is kind of a point system as far as if it's like Vegas is. So if they played Bay City Western based on ratings after iteration 1, there's a 30-point difference, and that's what you would predict as far as an outcome of the game on a neutral site. And then the same thing for rating 8. So you go through 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The rating for Mount Pleasant has changed, increased a little bit to 31. Rating 128, that's now up to 33, 34. And then at 2048, that is flattening. It's not changing hardly at all per iteration. So it's 34 points still. And the same for the other schools, that they're all done the same way with their own schedules. So flaws in the system. I don't know who said it, but it's a good point. The ball is oblong and takes funny bounces. So team A could play Team B twice in a season. You get totally different scores. They are somewhat predictable, but I've seen as much as 100-point swings in a season. Back in 1912, I think there's a situation where there was Team B. Team A beats, or St. Albans, I think it was, beat a Virginia school by 116 points, and 3 or 4 weeks later they played again. I don't know if it's the same side or not, but there was only a 10-point difference in the game. So balls change, team changes over the season. Next thing I want to cover is just on computer systems. It's there's the flaws in that is before week 7 of the season, computer ratings are interesting in the least. It's just way the statistics runs. You can get always going to be some fluke scores, and there's going to be, with 16,000 teams, you're going to have a fluke after fluke after fluke after fluke, and that could give a one team or a few teams that have really high rankings, and you're like, look at them and say, what, where does this come from? And that's part of the flaws of this system as far as a computer versus just people's intuitions. They're pretty good in knowing who's a good team or not, and so that's why a lot of times the computer polls are a lot different than the human polls at the beginning of the season. But I think the computer polls actually are much better at the end of the season than the people polls. So far I have 3 main games in the database. There's typos and inaccuracies are going to come up from just gathering data and reporting. Even from the initial, newspapers account of the game can have the wrong score, and that's transferred over, and then it's got a typo. Or we've got 3 St. Mary's teams in New Jersey, and do I have the right one? I don't know. I'm missing data. So we have half the games pre-2004, I would believe, and decreasing, or 2000, or half of the games in whole are missing from the pre-2004, and that is distributed, and we have more games in 2003, or percentage in 2003 than in 1877, but that's just the nature of the beast. All games are treated equally. Some would think that would want that the playoff games and the championship games are treated differently. I don't do that. So we have a situation last year where we had 2 great schools in California vying for the national championship. They played twice last year. The outcome of the games were flip-flop. So I ended up ranking the team that won in the regular season as actually the national championship, but they lost in the playoffs. Is that right? Well, that's my computer system. Teams change over the season, so if you have a quarterback injury, those games before he got injured are treated just the same as after he's injured and out for the season, and that's to keep fair, but it's not very predictive as far as what the future results are. Isolated conferences, groups, rules, seasons. I do include 6-man and 8-man, and obviously they don't play each other, or for the most part they don't play. Sometimes in Texas, and just schools that play that, they'll play a mixed game, or one team will switch over from 11-man to an 8-man, or vice versa, and they'll play each other. But mostly those teams are very isolated, except for when a team switches over from 11-man football to 8-man football. And the only way you can do that is to grab their pre-switch and compare them to how they did when they went to the new system, and they shouldn't change drastically, but obviously do. So you try to average all that out. So that's my system. Let me know if you have a better way. If you see a fundamental flaw in that. We can talk about even using different algorithm, what I have, and process the 3 million games in a different way. Have a good day. Next week I'll see you, and we'll talk about the top 25 teams of all time, according to me.